My name is Simon Locke, and I'm actually the Vice President of the Foreign Press Association. So for those who are used to Ian Williams, our illustrious leader, being with us for most Zooms, he is deputized to me for this particular one. And so I'm actually delighted that we are going to be talking with Rebecca Fannin. Rebecca is a journalist, author, media entrepreneur. You grew up in Ohio, and that is partly sort of related to this story, right?
It definitely is.
It absolutely is. So we're going to talk a little bit about this idea of what is generally known, I think, as flyover country or the heartland. From where there's a shift that's taken place, or is still taking place, right? From Rust Belt to Tech Belt. And we're going to touch upon some additional topics around that, which will be contemporary issues in terms of there are a lot of layoffs that have been going on in the technology industry. What does that really mean? With interest rates high, venture capital is more limited than it's been in the past for technology startups. So what do we think that the future is going to be there? And also, I think there's going to be a little bit of a discussion in terms of China, because Rebecca, you are really one of the gurus as far as tracking China's technology progress. And you've authored Silicon Dragon, Startup Asia, and you've been a commentator, regularly featured, and have interviewed many of the leading Chinese entrepreneurs and US ones. So you have some perspective on that.
Right. And my latest book, previous book to this current one, it was Tech Titans of China.
Yes. Yes. Well, look, why don't we start with, I think, very interested to hear what was sort of the origin story. What is it that led you to write the book, Silicon Heartland? And when you're writing a book, generally you're writing something, I assume, because you thought there's a story that actually is not particularly well understood, that somehow or other it was important to know what was going on in the heartland, in the Rust Belt. So what was that journey? What took you to this place?
It's true that the heartland has been overlooked, and it's been looked at as flyover country, neglected by journalists who tend to be on the coast, in New York City and California and Boston, just like venture capital is concentrated in the coast. And it's been depleted by the industrial era ending in the United States and factories going overseas to China and to Mexico. I saw this trend happening, and I saw it from my own eyes in growing up in Ohio, and then going to New York, and then going to Silicon Valley, and going to China. So I was able to spot this trend in the Silicon Heartland very early on, because of my roots in Ohio, and going back with fresh eyes after being away for about 20 years and covering China so much. And so when COVID hit in 2020, I was not going to China anymore. And the Heartland beckoned with a great story that I'd been tracking for at least a year before, or a couple years before. And so I put that project on the front burner, and I took off in my Honda Element car and did a whole series of grassroots interviews from Morgantown, West Virginia, to Pittsburgh, to Dayton, to Columbus, to Indianapolis, Detroit, Flint. I mean, I went to all of the Rust Belt cities, the Great Lakes states, and spent a lot of time interviewing business leaders and mayors and economic developers and innovators and town champions who are making this transition happen from Rust Belt to Tech Belt.
These transitions, and actually lots of the kind of great transitions in sort of post-industrial revolution, they always take time, right? And in a way, you don't necessarily, it's sometimes hard to see change actually happening. But if you stop and you look back and then go, wow, you know, maybe it was a bar or all the restaurants were closed down, and now it's all kind of trendy restaurants and people are hanging out with computers talking about, you know, how they're going to raise more funds. Is there part of that your journey when you know you were sort of viscerally seeing some of these changes that were taking place that made you stop and go, well, this is different, and this is not necessarily you would not necessarily see this if you were maybe on the coast.
Oh, yeah. And for me, coming back after being away for so many years and really only coming back to the region for family visits and holidays. So I really was only seeing it through those eyes. But then coming back and doing this exploration, you know, I did see these downtowns that are coming back, and lots of bars and restaurants and new hotels, and millennials going out and dating, and you know, all kinds of activity, and a real diverse population as well, where you have a lot of minorities who are participating in this boom in these cities, in these inner cities, and creating this creativity burst, places like in Detroit. So, you know, when I was traveling throughout the heartland, you know, I got to see this all firsthand. The Black Lives Matter movement was happening that summer too, and continued on. I went back a couple more times after the first leg of the trip. And, you know, I kept reinforcing this idea that, yeah, the heartland is changing, and definitely in clusters, particularly around universities, just like Silicon Valley has Stanford and Berkeley, and New York City has a wealth of universities. Well, the Heartland has a lot of leading universities too, like Case Western Reserve in Cleveland and Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh. These universities are churning out talent that are creating innovations around technology, not the old line manufacturing. That's got to change. The factory work is going out and becoming much more advanced technology-wise. And so I saw all this happening. Like for instance, in Youngstown, former steel town, right?
Yep.
A major steel town. Today, there's a whole advanced manufacturing cluster in downtown Youngstown, a 5-building incubator all around 3D printing. And then Youngstown State University has an advanced manufacturing degree. So, you know, just seeing all this happening firsthand and getting to see it. And actually, during COVID, nobody was traveling, so you could get in and get interviews with a lot of different people, no problem at all. I interviewed so many mayors and, you know, town leaders that would have been probably impossible today to get those kind of interviews. But the timing was great because nobody was traveling except me and my Honda Element on the road.
Well, there's kind of, in a way, when we think of technology, we tend, you know, I think you made the point, is most people tend to think about the coast. We tend to think about Silicon Valley. You might think about New York, and you're going, technologies like Facebook or maybe the ones that sort of everyone, you know, is used to using. But there's probably no coincidence that at the end of the day, in the heartland, with industrial and agricultural roots, that maybe that is kind of, that those roots are actually shoots for new technology companies that are actually somehow or other drawing upon expertise within the region. Is that a reasonable way to think about it?
Yeah, I think it is. For instance, I'm thinking about Procter & Gamble in Cincinnati. And obviously, it's been a world-leading packaged goods maker, and it's also an innovator. So today, P&G, one of the startups that I write about in the region, is a spinoff from P&G technology in plastics recycling. And the technology came directly from P&G and was planted into this startup that has a factory now, has a plant, a recycling plant on the banks of the Ohio River. And so that's one really good example of this kind of change happening. And then with GM, of course, in Detroit, The auto factories, a lot of auto factories closed down, but today it's all about advanced mobility and AI and electric vehicles. So that's a driver of the future for Detroit. So it's been really interesting to see how tech gets into these industries and changes the industries. For instance, in insurance, it's all about how you drive today, and they can track that through AI, and then they can adjust your insurance premium based upon your driving habits. So Nationwide is making, as a policy like that in Columbus, and there's a lot of other startups in Columbus area that have grown out of that idea as well.
Is there a moment in time where you would look back and say this transition started, that there was a moment maybe where VC started to think about, well, actually, we need to fund, let's say, ag tech ventures. We actually need to be investing in technology companies that do what you're talking about, advanced manufacturing. And was there a moment in time when a few visionaries said, this is actually what we've got to do, we need to do something different? Or is it organic? Somehow or other, it is just beginning to grow over a period of time?
Oh, yeah. Well, there were a couple of trigger points. One of them was remote working in the pandemic caused a lot of relocation of talent to the Heartland. But another major factor was when Drive Capital, set up in Columbus, Ohio, by two former leading Silicon Valley venture capitalists, they picked up and they left Sand Hill Road and they went to Columbus and they set up Drive Capital. This was 2010. And they have since raised a lot of money, $1.2 billion, and invested in more than 60 startups in the Midwest, in the Heartland. And they're changing the culture. They're bringing Silicon Valley to the Heartland. And I think that that's a necessary thing for the Heartland to continue to rise, and it needs to rise faster than it is now.
Well, I think it's a reasonable question to be looking at all of this and saying, as technology comes into the Heartland, are there winners, are there losers, or is somehow or other the tide rises and is ultimately contributing to communities overall?
Well, I think this is happening in pockets. It's not region wide. Then, for instance, there's a big rural and urban divide too. So in some places, like in Appalachia, I visited Appalachia too and did some touring and exploratory in Appalachia, including Eastern Kentucky and West Virginia as part of the book. There are still places where there's no Wi-Fi and broadband connectivity. We assume that it's there, right? The coastal elites assume it's there, right? And in many Asian countries, it is there much more universally than it is in the United States. And the infrastructure is better in China too, in many cases, than we have in the United States. So there are these regions that are or these areas that are still left behind, and we need to catch up on that. I think some of the new federal spending that we're seeing now addresses infrastructure, addresses Wi-Fi, addresses the chips, shortage, the fact that semiconductor production has moved a lot to Taiwan and South Korea and mainland China, and the United States, which used to be a leader in production, needs to now develop its own semiconductor production. Granted, U.S. leads in the design of these semiconductor chips, but not in the production. So that's why I write about in my book, companies like Intel, of course, Intel from Silicon Valley, has invested $20 billion into a new semiconductor plant in central Ohio, which is only 30 miles from my hometown. And that's being built right now. So that's gonna really change a lot of the agricultural land surrounding Columbus, and I think it will also change the culture.
Is it your sense that, as you mentioned, COVID,
yes,
being sort of a fundamental changer of a lot of dynamics, as you said, people moved home and wanted to steer far clear of the cities. But is so now we're kind of fair enough to say, even though still people are dying of COVID quite a lot, the reality is that we're in a post-COVID world. Will that change the dynamics, in terms of what's actually been going on, or really should we again be thinking about this as this is something you mentioned 2010, is this really a long-term trend that COVID maybe have boosted or accelerated like many other things, or is it something that actually is at risk with the post-COVID, potentially companies are getting more people to return to work, et cetera, et cetera?
Right. Well, I think it's been a boost to the heartland because so many people left Silicon Valley, became too congested, too costly, and then during remote working, then people could move to places with lower cost of living and maybe go back to be with their families and still do the same kind of work, but just remotely. And I think that this has been a boom to the heartland. I've seen Zoom towns develop. So that's been pretty interesting as well. Now, I think this is the lasting, this is going to have lasting impact. It's not everybody's going to move back to Silicon Valley now, particularly now that there's been so many tech layoffs in Silicon Valley. The heartland is still rising, and we're still seeing more venture capital going into the heartland and more startups going into the heartland and more innovation drivers. While the future of Silicon Valley, definitely I think it will continue to be the leader in technology worldwide, but its impact may be somewhat diminished as you see more and more cities rise up, like Austin, Texas. Has captured a lot of the energy of Silicon Valley today. So I think COVID accelerated it, and I think it's lasting.
And so this idea of with tech layoffs actually going on for many of the big firms, and as they resize or optimize performance, et cetera, whatever the language is used around it. I suppose it's never a good thing necessarily if you lose your job. On the other hand, this could also be one of those moments where it spins out a lot of highly talented people, and they end up being sort of a new wave of entrepreneurs spread across the country.
Yeah, well, we are seeing that this dispersion, this decentralization of Silicon Valley. And another trend that's happening too, just to bring China into this discussion as well, it used to be that there was a lot more cooperation and collaboration with China and the US over technology, innovation, and research and development, but that's not happening now. And I don't think that it's going to it's going to change much in the future, except probably more restrictions placed. That kind of factor, which was an influence in the heartland as well as Silicon Valley, is diminished. Some Chinese companies some China companies actually purchased some abandoned factory plants in the heartland and took them over, or took over companies that were in trouble, and actually have helped them in the past to reach profitability, like Folio Glass in Dayton, which was the subject of that great documentary that the Obamas produced, An American Factory, I think. I visited that factory outside of Dayton, and it was remarkable to see it today and see it prospering and see it with so many different types of workers there, Chinese, Americans, Black, just complete diversity on the factory floor, and very automated too. So yeah, the Chinese have had their impact in the heartland, but that is diminished today. And also, I think that that's a lasting trend, at least for the foreseeable future, whatever the foreseeable future is, 5 years, 10 years.
Well, there's no doubt that the geopolitical context is dramatically different, right? From the times that you were writing your books on, the rise of technology in China, to where we are today in terms of
Yeah.
fear of China and the idea that we, you know, that the US would be banning something like TikTok is, I assume it's kind of, it must be night and day as you think about the promise of maybe even 5 years ago and where we are today. Is what do you
Yeah.
see the future?
Yeah. I mean, when I was writing about, and I still am covering and tracking what's happening in China, I'm just not going there like I was regularly, like all the time regularly, for many, many years. Anyhow, that makes it much more difficult to cover a trend when you can't go there so often. Because I always believe in grassroots journalism and interviewing people locally in person to get a real read on it. But I think, we've moved from this Silicon Dragon era, and I see my new book, Silicon Heartland, almost like a counterpoint to what happened with China tech and the Heartland, with all this new investment going into the Heartland and the administration pinpointing these regional innovation hubs for growth. This can help to improve our overall economy in the US and help us to continue to be the world's, leader in technology and economic leader and so forth. Even though we've seen trends like China's patents and China's venture capital, China's R&D all catching up to the United States. But the Heartland has a chance, has the opportunity to weigh in and change this trajectory.
Well, it does strike me that one of the maybe again similarly undercovered stories of the moment may actually be the ongoing. It seems like there's a significant ongoing trend towards onshoring, whereas if you are all of a sudden going, supply chains, global ones are broken, you've got to figure out as a company how to make sure that you've got the ability to produce in the US.
Yeah.
Do you think that is also part of this story, and it's as equally as applicable to technology as it would be to industrial products?
Oh yeah, it is. This whole supply chain issue is very much a part of the story, and the reshoring, right? Like you just mentioned, the reshoring of jobs to America, made in America. Again, we've heard it before, but maybe now there's a little bit more money behind it. And force, because it's also the state money as well, and many other drivers of what's happening with this transformation. But yes, reshoring is happening. It's happening gradually because delinking from the supply chains in China is very difficult. It's very challenging. Takes a very long time, and finding new sources of the supplies, it's not easy. Companies have looked to Vietnam and Southeast Asia for some of that, but the US is, of course, another destination for reshoring, and we are starting to see some companies reshore jobs, but it's very gradual because it's so challenging. We need those supply chains close to home, like we saw with the pandemic. If anybody was looking for a car during that time, shopping for a car, they had to wait months and months and months for their order to come. So if you have supply chains that are local, that are regional, that's not going to be an issue.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting to see these kind of, again, it's almost like a megatrend, right? There is something fundamental going on, and that from a geopolitical standpoint, actually, it's extracting companies' ability to extract from Russia after the invasion of Ukraine is kind of one thing, but Russia wasn't necessarily that integrated into global supply chains and stuff.
Yeah.
Segregating, taking itself out from China is just a whole monumental challenge that would be almost impossible to achieve, right?
Yeah, because there's so many components that are made in China. Take anything you buy at Walmart, and just look at Made in China, made in China, made in China. Okay.
Well, you know, as you were reporting for the book and you were getting to talk to individuals, are there any kind of personal type stories, stories that really kind of resonated, that you think encapsulate the impact of these changes on communities in the heartland?
Well, one of the most memorable interviews that I did was with John Chambers, the chairman emeritus of Cisco, who is a very famous business leader who has been giving back to his home state of West Virginia, and interviewing him, where he would comment and say, well, if we don't change, we're going to be disrupted. You know, you have to change. You have to face the future with courage. You have to be willing to change. And so I think that that is part of the culture of the heartland, is that there has to be this willingness to change. You have to disrupt. You've got to move forward with innovation. If you're stuck with your old steel mills and your old coal mines and your old chemical plants, that's not the future. The future is really everything technology embedded into all of these industries and markets. So you've got to be able to move from that old factory work and old coal mining work. So interviewing him and also hearing about how much he was contributing to his alma mater, West Virginia University, was remarkable. And there are other people like that that I interviewed, such as Brad Smith, who was the CEO of Intuit in Silicon Valley. Well, he quit, he left Intuit, and he moved back to his home state of West Virginia, and he became president of Marshall University. So that was, you know, I thought that was rather touching, and that actually he was sincere in talking about wanting to go back to his homeland, and he did. So, but there's many other examples of startups, entrepreneurs I met, and mayors that I met, and business leaders and innovators that I met, who are all just working very hard and struggling against, you know, in some cases, some pretty major odds.
Well, you know, what are some of the some of the odds that you were hearing about?
Well, sure. I mean, venture capital is one of them. But even though Drive Capital moved in, and we have seen an increase in venture capital and even some coastal money that's moved into the heartland to take advantage of what's happening, there's still a shortage of venture capital. So, you know, it's only about 8% of the venture capital spending goes to the Great Lakes states. So that would be Indiana, Ohio, Illinois, you know, Michigan, those states, right? And they get about 8% of the money for startups, which means that these startups have got to find sources to fund their businesses. And, you know, in this case, they've got to be able to stretch the dollars. So I met many entrepreneurs who are very good at stretching the dollars. For instance, this fellow in Pittsburgh who is a Carnegie Mellon University graduate, and he's got this new parking meter app that makes it easy to, you know, put the meter, not have to deal with coins and all that. And so, and it can track where meters are empty. And anyhow, it's an app for parking meters that he developed at Carnegie Mellon. And, you know, he struggled a lot to get funding for that. And finally, he did get some regional venture capital money. So that's happening. So, you know, you do see, and he kept his costs low, because I remember interviewing him at his office in Braddock, Pennsylvania. Okay, the interesting thing about Braddock is that it has the last standing steel mill in Pittsburgh. The last one, can you believe it? And so his office is like, his building, his place is right down the street from this old steel mill that's still going, you know, on the riverside. And it's, you know, when I walked in there, I thought, yeah, well, this is kind of a startup that knows how to keep what they call the burn low, keep the, you know, cash flowing and the burn low.
Well, I think there's you know, often there's this idea that, you know, most startups are flush with cash, and in some cases they have been in the past. But there's probably, I don't know if this is something that is beneficial for or something you saw in Rust Belt type entrepreneurs, that do you get some sense of there is a thriftiness based upon where
Oh,
you
yeah.
are, and
Oh, yeah.
and is that sort of part of the culture of
Yeah.
actually just being in the heartland?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Midwesterners are known as being very nice and polite and everything is good, right? But there also could be very thrifty. So I think that this is something that I saw in China too. The Chinese entrepreneurs knew how to, maximize whatever funding they got and keep the costs really low and really innovate and produce and get the profits coming in so that they didn't have to go hungry for cash, hungry for venture capital. So I think that was a commonality between the Chinese and the Heartland startups. It just struck me that, yeah, that was definitely something that was very familiar to me.
Well, I think in your book, there's at some point you were talking about there's also venture capital focused on diverse entrepreneurs. Can you talk a little bit about kind of how that has sort of played out?
Oh yeah, I mean that was also very fascinating when I went to Tulsa, Oklahoma. Well, Tulsa, Oklahoma is Black Wall Street, right? And it's all about the revival of Black Wall Street today. So I went to their Black Venture Summit, and it was very well attended. 300 people attended, and these are all minority entrepreneurs who have their own startups, or there are minority investors who are looking for, a home run from this community. And I have to say that minority entrepreneurs, if you think the Great Lakes get very little of the venture capital money, well, the minority entrepreneurs get about 2% of it. So there's a real shortage of money for minority entrepreneurs. But if you look at the population patterns in many of these leading cities like Detroit and Cleveland, it's a high percentage of minorities. So and they tend to be very creative, and so they are part of this whole startup economy. And so I write about them. I write about a Pittsburgh-based Steelers football player who became a venture capitalist in Pittsburgh, and now he's a major player in the venture capital scene. I wrote about other minority entrepreneurs as well, so and investors as well. So they're all highlighted in a chapter about what's happening in the Heartland with more diversification. Actually, a lot more diversification than you see in Silicon Valley.
Which is a positive thing, clearly, right?
Yeah, I think it is. Yeah, like Detroit has a real buzz of energy and creativity around it.
Well, I remember actually I was in Detroit probably more than a decade ago, and it was just starting to see. It may have been at the nadir. I actually was at a meeting at GM, and I remember actually talking to the guys who were there and saying, I'd love to go out and kind of see the rest of Detroit. This was, in the gleaming Detroit, the GM towers. I didn't see what was around it. And they said, look, if you're going to see what's the decline, the really depressed, awful state of many things, you just have to kind of go down the street or half a mile outside. And I also lived in Japan, and one of the issues that we saw in Japan is that you have the cities doing well, but there's a hollowing out of the countryside.
Yeah.
So it sounds as though that, and maybe that's overly optimistic, that the Silicon Heartland is a counterpoint, that it's not a hollowing out, it's a repopulating. But how broad do you think that goes? How broad is the impact? You said earlier, there's still a long way to go, but yeah, it's clearly something that is felt in these towns.
Right. So in my book, I did highlight the Heartland trends of population of millennials and tech workers moving in, and some of them have gained substantially, like Louisville and Nashville are among the top leaders in attracting new talent in, and this is changing. So in my book also, I highlighted about a dozen cities. I mean, I traveled throughout the region. I've traveled quite a few more cities than that, but there were special sections on Detroit, on Cleveland, on Pittsburgh, on Dayton, on Louisville, on Flint, and on Indianapolis, and Morgantown in West Virginia. So there, and there were special sections on them talking about the particular technology that's emerging in those cities. So it's not like it's all software in Silicon Valley, right? In the heartland, it tends to be specialization by city. So that was really interesting to me. Like Pittsburgh is about AI and robotics because of Carnegie Mellon. Dayton is about a lot of military applications because of the Air Force Research Lab being there and all of the spending that's coming out of the Air Force Research Lab. And they're investing and helping startups get going with military applications in Dayton. So Cleveland, there's a lot of biotech innovation around the Cleveland Clinic, world famous Cleveland Clinic, and also Case Western Reserve University there. So Indianapolis, I could keep going. Indianapolis is about SaaS, software as a service, because Salesforce went in and they bought an Indianapolis company. And then the founders of that company went on and they created a venture studio. And then that studio invested in about 60 more startups in software as a service. So, each place has a tech cluster. So it is pretty broad, to answer your question. It's pretty broad. And it's also specialized by city. And not totally specialized, but it tends to be a focal point in each place. Like I mentioned before, Youngstown with 3D printing. So interesting trends to see at play.
So for journalists and our members who are writing about, and generally international reporters looking at the US, or audiences outside the US and who are interested in it, as well as those who are here and looking at the US in that global context, is there are there things that you think the journalist or the media community needs to kind of focus in more on to really look at some of these types of stories? Maybe things that they should be less focused on in order to capture the story. What's your perspective as someone who's been writing about this, going, you don't want to give away your secret sauce, right? It's like, this is my story. I've got this great path here. But what do you think should be kind of the takeaways for other journalists as they think about this big trend?
Well, I think it has been overlooked because it is rather challenging to cover. It's a driving market. You don't just fly into one market and then everything is there. Like if you fly into Beijing, right? You fly into Beijing, or you fly into Tokyo, and you can cover quite a bit in one city. In this case, you really have to cover a broad region. And so I found myself driving 4 hours to this place, then 4 hours to this, then 4 hours to that place. Drive. And so I think it has been overlooked, and I think it's been underestimated to a large degree. Everyone, technology is the huge news funnel today. It's the great thing to cover. It's happening. It's exciting. It's Chat GPT. It's AI. It's all these. It's Tesla and Elon Musk and SpaceX. So covering the heartland, and which has more of a industrial spin to it, and tech-enabled kind of businesses, very practical kinds of technologies, has been overlooked. So I think it's very important and can actually move the economy forward of the heartland. But the attention of journalists tends to go where the sexy characters are, or the loudest politicians are,
or where bullets are flying, right?
Or bullets are flying. Yes. So I have to say that J.D. Vance is from Ohio and Northern Kentucky, like myself. And I just saw him in Washington, D.C. last week. I went to a summit about chips, semiconductor, not potato chips, but chips, semiconductor chips. And then I ran into JD Vance later on that day at the summit that Dayton was holding in DC, where a lot of people flew in from Dayton to DC. I guess they're, trying to have more impact for Dayton. And so it was interesting to see him there. And JD Vance is certainly getting into the limelight these days. So a character like that can actually, I think, get more exposure for the Heartland.
We have one question,
Our new
which is
senator from Ohio,
right.
Yes.
So we have one question where it's actually that I think this is kind of gets to the heart of the transformation sort of old industries and the rise of new industries. So it's, in the Netherlands, that when workers were laid off in some industries, that there was an effort in the interim to provide training technology for upcoming growth areas. It's not clear that I think what we probably have seen is that in some industries, there's sort of a focus, particularly on a local basis, of like, keep coal no matter what, right? Or stick to what we've kind of been doing. And then there's a resistance to change, or maybe not the investment that actually needs to be made to make these transitions. But if you're a coal miner, you're going to teach a coal miner to do a technology job. What are you seeing in terms of, where the investments have been made in terms of helping people through these transitions?
Oh, this is an issue for the Heartland because we have transition from factory work, which used to be a large part of the economy, to a much more depleted state today for the Heartland. So you do have training that's needed. And when I just have been on the book tour in the region, and I saw many training centers. I visited many training centers for technology. They're gearing up for Intel moving in, and we got to get more engineers who can take these kinds of jobs. And so the training is happening. It is an issue that's being addressed in the Heartland, and particularly in these areas where there's all this new investment coming in. And that's a positive. And that's another way that is to bring China in again. And China has its own plans, its own economic development, its own training and all that. And now the U.S. has much more of an industrial policy too, which training is part of that, and workforce development is part of that.
I think Bill Gates said, in 2 years we overestimate what can be achieved, and in 10 years we sort of, in general, we underestimate what will actually be accomplished. As you think about, as you think about kind of based upon your experience, what do you think, we should be imagining is going to be the future in 2 years in the Heartland, or maybe in 10 years in the Heartland?
Yeah, I'd say it's more like a 10-year period. It's happening gradually. It's not at the fast pace that I saw in China, which in a decade, these cities sprung up, Shanghai, Beijing, unbelievable. But you're not seeing that in the Heartland. It's much more gradual. So I'm going to give it a decade, but I think that we will see a lot more of these data centers and semiconductor plants and battery plants and 3D printing operations and many other types of new technologies such as in recycling and sustainability emerging in the Heartland. So that's all happening now, but I think it's gradual. And so 2 years maybe won't look too much different, but in a decade, I think it could. And, when on my road trip, I just got back from my road trip on the book tour. And when I mentioned that, look, your market's not going to look like this in a decade. And they looked at me like, stunned. What do you mean? We don't want this change. And in a way, it was like, oh, we know it's coming, but we're kind of don't want to give up our, our old-fashioned heartland values. But I do think that the culture is going to change. It will become a little bit more like Silicon Valley.
Well, I suppose it's to some extent this is all generational, right? It's like for older generations tend to kind of stick to what they know. Younger generations are going to be looking for something different, and
Yeah.
the more opportunities there are, it's going to be a world for younger people, right?
Yeah. So that actually makes me think of something else too. Like some of these places are actually paying young, millennial, tech talented types of people with their families to move in, to relocate. So West Virginia has a program like that, and Tulsa has a program like that. And these programs are actually working. People are going there and getting $10,000 or $12,000 to relocate, and they're staying. And so they can help to create new jobs in these areas and help to change the culture to a more younger, hip generation.
Well, it's I'm actually based in New York's Hudson Valley, and I can say over the last 10 years, it is also pretty transformational.
Yeah.
And I think in a way, as we have the conversation about the heartland and the Rust Belt, there are probably lots of other places that may not be kind of the center that people think of New York or Silicon Valley, but other places throughout the country that may actually also be undergoing similar types of changes.
Yeah, for instance, Stamford, Connecticut, which was a lock-making town, now is becoming a financial hub, and also with crypto even. So that's been a major change for Stamford. Buffalo is undergoing major revitalization of its downtown. Actually, almost all of these heartland cities the downtowns are being rebuilt, restored, or new buildings going in. And it's not just a matter of the suburbs, right? It's actually the downtowns are being rebuilt. And even in my hometown, where I just was recently, there's a lot of new cafes that have opened up. And I thought, I'll just work downtown. I'm used to working remotely anywhere, right? So I went downtown Lancaster, worked there and for a day. And, it was fun just being part of the community. So yeah, these areas are definitely changing, and the lifestyles are changing. Options are opening up. New businesses are moving in. New people are moving in, and it's not stagnant, and it's not necessarily in decline like it was. Although, if you look at the Census Bureau figures, there are certain cities that are still declining in population, but not all of them. Columbus has had a 15% population increase, 15% increase in a decade. And Indianapolis has had almost a 9% increase in population in the last decade. On the other hand, Detroit is still losing, and Cleveland is still losing. Cincinnati is pretty much stabilized and actually gained a little bit. So it's a mixed picture. There are these cities that are booming more than others.
Which I assume is that's sort of inevitable in a way, I suppose.
Yeah.
If you so our last couple of questions, and then we'll kind of wrap up. But there are a couple of things that are going on in Washington, obviously, right now.
Yeah.
Legislative changes, and so worth asking how these will impact. So CHIPS Act, the investment in technology, what impact do you think that will have? And then the second question is then going, with the conversations that are going on now about the budget battle, there's the whole invest in sort of in technology that is kind of the key platform of and green technology of the Biden administration. How important are these legislative changes to maintaining and sustaining the types of trends you've actually been seeing and describing?
Yeah, I think initiatives like Build Back Better are very important. We need to build back our infrastructure and that's the roads, the bridges, the rails, the Wi-Fi. China has gotten ahead of us on all of these aspects. The cities are more modern than our cities, and the infrastructure is more modern than our infrastructure. So this new money is, in a way, allocated to compete with China, and I think it's very important. The money is going out. The Department of Commerce is doling out money to regional innovation hubs. And these are places that are overlooked places. It's not all going to California and New York. It's going to former Rust Belt cities that really need this money to change and get into this new groove of growth. So yeah, I think it's all the semiconductor spending as well. A huge amount for semiconductor production to move it back to the United States. And so science and technology and R&D and startups are all being highlighted by this new federal spending, and additional federal spending. It's not totally new, but some of it is additional. So yeah, I think it's very important, and the Heartland is taking it very seriously, and they're competing. These cities are competing for the money. Yeah, there's very competitive.
You know, there's a dystopian view, which has always been around for a long time, of the idea of, you know, technology basically will eliminate jobs. You know, the whole conversation about ChatGPT is like, well, people are asking, like, is my job going to go? Is my job going to disappear? But if we sort of think about what you're writing about and seeing, there are these fundamental changes, and there are clearly new jobs being created, different types of jobs, and as sort of a conclusion for the takeaway for everyone who's joined this or will view it, you know, is your sense that these trends are ultimately, they're, I think, positive, something that we should be aware of? Is technology the boogeyman that you know, some people kind of fear, or ultimately, to some extent, you know, without these changes, you know, we would have a hollowed out America.
Oh yeah, no, I think it's very important that we embrace a technology innovation future, and it's very important for the United States leadership of the global economy. Technology is a huge driver of economic growth, and whoever wins this tech race is going to be the global superpower. And right now we're in a race, and we're seeing it play out every day, with friction over TikTok and other Huawei and other Chinese companies. So yeah, I think this is an opportunity for the Heartland to rise up and help the whole United States keep its superpower status. That's how I see it. And you know, from my covering China for so many years and having global perspective, you know, I feel like I'm not just coming at this as a booster for the Heartland, just, you know, single focus on the Heartland. I see it in context.
Well, Rebecca, thank you very much indeed for spending this time with us. And I know on your busy kind of travel tour and book tour, and for anyone who's interested in knowing more, do you have a copy of the book handy?
Oh yeah,
you can wave it in front of everyone and say, "This is on Amazon."
Yeah, it's on Amazon. It's on Barnes and Noble. It's in the physical stores, and it's available online, and it's in Kindle version as well. So, and it just launched and has a lot of great endorsements, including from Ro Khanna, our congressman in Silicon Valley, even, and many other leaders, Jim Breyer from Breyer Capital, who was an original investor in Facebook, and many other leading startups. He's now moved to Austin, Texas, so he's doing the Heartland thing too. But yeah, Silicon Heartland, from Rust Belt to Tech Belt. There it is.
You heard it here.
Don't miss
Well,
it.
it's a great read, and it tells a very, I think, what is a very human story. And there's the predecessor, Silicon Dragon.
Yeah, that's the one on China, the original one on China. And I'll show one more. show and tell here for a second.
Excellent. Wonderful.
Okay.
Well,
Yeah. Sorry.
Rebecca,
You like the book. You like the book.
I did. I found that one of the things that was very interesting was this telling these human kind of stories as the way that you told it makes it very tangible. This is not a sort of like details of technology. It's a human story, and I've always believed that. I think in many respects there's an underlying flow of behind all of this stuff, which is a lot of technology is actually about is very human, or it is, you know, powering other parts of the economy that may be traditional industries that keep people employed, and it's very important to what's going on.
Oh, it is. It is. And, you know, and part of this book is my own personal journey of covering from Silicon Dragon to Silicon Heartland and coming back to Ohio. And so it's a little bit about my personal journey, and like I left Ohio. If I would have stayed, would I have been trapped? Would I have fallen into, you know, some despair, or, you know, some poverty, you know, whatever, or opioid addiction? But I left, right? I left. And in hindsight, that leaving was good because it gave me a whole new perspective, a new horizon to come back and then see it with fresh eyes and see the whole Heartland region growing up just like I grew up.
Well, look, Rebecca, thanks very much indeed. For everyone who's joined us, thank you for taking the time. Thanks for watching this. The Foreign Press Association needs everyone's support. If you're interested in more videos like this, subscribe to our YouTube channel. And support the organization at foreignpressassociation.org. So, Rebecca,
Absolutely.
Thanks very much indeed. Have a great afternoon.
Well, thank you, Simon, for all the great questions and the good conversation. Really appreciate it.